The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, its golden hues glinting off the polished lens of a phone camera. A girl stood alone in the clearing, her silhouette etched against the backdrop of swaying trees. Her movements were fluid yet sharp, each step more precise than the last. Her feet, clad in scuffed sneakers, danced to a rhythm that only she could hear. The girl moved with a ferocity and grace that seemed almost otherworldly, her passion igniting the empty space around her. This wasn't just a dance. It was a statement, a rebellion against everything that had been said about her. Her name was Emma Collins, a quiet high school junior who had spent most of her life being invisible. But today, invisibility was no longer an option. Unbeknownst to Emma, her performance was being recorded by a passerby, someone who had stopped mid-jog, mesmerized by the girl's raw energy. This wasn't the kind of dancing you saw every day, not in a sleepy town like Greystone, where TikTok trends and school cliques dictated social hierarchy. This was personal, visceral, and undeniably captivating. What made it all the more remarkable was that just a week ago, Emma had been the laughingstock of her school. A viral video of her failed audition for the Sparkle Squad, the most popular TikTok dance group in town, had circulated like wildfire. In it, Emma stood awkwardly in the school gymnasium, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, as the Sparkle Squad's leader, Madison James, mocked her in front of a crowd. Madison's voice had dripped with condescension as she said, "Sorry, Emma. We're looking for someone with actual talent." The video ended with a close-up of Emma's face, her eyes brimming with tears. The rejection wasn't just cruel. It was calculated. Madison and her crew had uploaded the video to TikTok with the caption, "When she thinks she can hang with the Sparkle Squad." Within hours, it had thousands of views, with comments ranging from snarky emojis to outright insults. For Emma, it felt like her world had collapsed. She'd always been an easy target for people like Madison, introverted, bookish, and too shy to stand up for herself. But this was a new level of humiliation. In the days that followed, Emma became the subject of whispers and side glances at school. Even the teachers seemed to tread carefully around her, unsure of how to address the situation. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, some from classmates trying to offer sympathy, others from strangers piling onto the mockery. Emma stopped checking her social media altogether. She stopped talking to her friends, retreating further into her shell. Her parents tried to help, but their advice felt hollow. "Just ignore them," her mother said one evening, her voice gentle but ineffective. "People will move on to the next thing soon enough." Emma wanted to believe that, but the sting of Madison's words and the laughter of the crowd echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. It was during one of these low moments that Emma met Mrs. Harper, her next-door neighbor. Mrs. Harper was a retired dance instructor who had moved to Greystone a few years ago. She was in her 70s, with silver hair that she always wore in a neat bun, and a wardrobe that consisted mostly of pastel cardigans. Emma had known her in passing, but had never really spoken to her. That changed one evening when Emma was sitting on her front porch, headphones in, trying to drown out the world with music. Mrs. Harper, who was watering her azaleas, noticed Emma's slumped posture and approached her. "Mind if I join you?" Mrs. Harper asked, gesturing to the empty spot on the porch swing. Emma shrugged, not trusting herself to speak. For a while, they sat in silence, the crickets filling the void between them. "I saw the video," Mrs. Harper said finally. Emma stiffened, her face burning with shame. She braced herself for the pity, or worse, the unsolicited advice. But Mrs. Harper surprised her. "What those girls did to you was despicable. But you know what? I watched your audition, and I saw something they didn't." Emma turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've got something they can't fake. Heart," Mrs. Harper said, her voice firm. "Those girls, they're all polish and no substance. But you dance like it matters." Emma didn't know how to respond. No one had ever talked to her like this before, not even her parents. Mrs. Harper leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. "I used to teach dance, you know. If you're willing to put in the work, I can help you show those girls exactly what they missed out on." At first, Emma was hesitant. The idea of dancing again, of putting herself out there, felt impossible. But there was something about Mrs. Harper's confidence in her, something that sparked a flicker of hope. Reluctantly, Emma agreed to give it a try. The next day, she showed up at Mrs. Harper's house, her nerves jangling. Mrs. Harper had cleared out her garage, transforming it into a makeshift dance studio. Mirrors lined one wall, and an old stereo sat on a folding table in the corner. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. Mrs. Harper wasted no time, putting Emma through her paces with warm-ups, drills, and choreography that was far more challenging than anything she'd attempted before. Again, Mrs. Harper would say whenever Emma faltered, "And this time, feel the music." At first, Emma struggled to keep up. Her muscles ached, and her frustration threatened to overwhelm her. But Mrs. Harper was patient, pushing her without being harsh. Slowly but surely, Emma began to improve. She discovered a strength and determination within herself that she hadn't known existed. Dancing became her escape, her therapy, and her weapon against the doubt that Madison and her crew had planted in her mind. One evening, as Emma practiced a particularly complex routine, Mrs. Harper stopped her mid-step. "You're ready," she said simply. "Ready for what?" Emma asked, panting. "To show the world what you can do," Mrs. Harper replied with a sly smile. That's how Emma found herself in the park, performing the routine she and Mrs. Harper had worked on for weeks. The idea had been Mrs. Harper's, to film the dance and post it on TikTok. At first, Emma balked at the suggestion. "What if people laugh at me again?" she'd asked. "They might," Mrs. Harper admitted, "but you're not doing this for them. You're doing this for you." Now, as Emma finished her final move, a dramatic leap followed by a spin, she felt a surge of adrenaline like never before. For the first time, she didn't care what anyone thought. She was dancing for herself, and that was enough. Or so she thought. The next morning, Emma woke up to find her phone buzzing incessantly. When she finally checked it, her jaw dropped. The video had gone viral. Thousands of people had watched, liked, and commented on her performance. But unlike the first video, this one was filled with praise. People marveled at her talent, her passion, and her courage. Some even called her an inspiration. Emma's world was about to change forever. Emma's journey to the park, where she would redefine her identity, began in a far more unremarkable way. It was a Monday morning, the kind of day that stretched on forever, filled with routine and expectations. For Emma, it was another opportunity to blend into the background. She slipped into her usual jeans and hoodie, grabbed her bag, and headed out the door, walking the short distance to Greystone High. The town of Greystone wasn't known for much, a cluster of suburban streets surrounded by a few mom-and-pop diners, a grocery store, and a community center, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Life in Greystone was predictable, and for Emma, that predictability was both a comfort and a cage. The hallways of Greystone High buzzed with the usual Monday morning chatter. Students moved in packs, clutching their phones as though their lives depended on them. Emma moved quietly, her head down, avoiding eye contact. It was better that way. No questions, no awkward conversations, and certainly no reminders of the video. But the whispers were inevitable. As she passed by, snippets of conversations reached her ears. "Did you see her audition? I can't believe she even tried. Madison really tore her apart." Emma's chest tightened, but she kept walking. She didn't need to see their faces to know they were talking about her. The humiliation was still fresh, and the sting of Madison's words lingered like an open wound. Madison James, the queen bee of Greystone High, leader of the Sparkle Squad, and the undisputed ruler of TikTok trends in their town. had turned Emma into a punchline. The Sparkle Squad was everything Emma wasn't: confident, glamorous, and effortlessly popular. Their TikTok dances had earned them thousands of followers, and their reputation was cemented as the school's golden girls. Madison, with her perfectly styled hair and infectious smile, was the face of the group. Her two best friends, Chloe and Taylor, were equally polished, their synchronized moves making them look like they'd stepped out of a music video. Emma had idolized them from afar. She wasn't delusional. She knew she didn't fit their mold. But dancing was her dream, her escape, her way of feeling alive. When the Sparkle Squad announced open auditions for a new member, Emma had hesitated. Her heart told her to go for it, but her head warned her of the risks. Ultimately, her heart won. It always did when it came to dance. The audition had been everything she feared and more. She remembered standing in the gym, her palms sweaty as Madison, and the others watched her with thinly veiled amusement. The music started, and Emma poured her soul into the routine. She knew she wasn't as polished as the others, but she danced with everything she had. When the music stopped, the room fell silent. For a fleeting moment, Emma thought she might have impressed them. Then Madison spoke. "That was brave," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But we're looking for someone with a little more flair. You understand, right?" Laughter erupted, not just from the Sparkle Squad, but from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Emma's cheeks burned as she muttered a quick thank you and bolted from the gym. The humiliation was bad enough, but it was the aftermath that truly crushed her. The video of her audition, filmed by one of Madison's friends, went viral within hours. Emma had never felt more alone. Her best friend, Lisa, tried to comfort her, but Emma pushed her away. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing her like this, not even Lisa. She stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria, choosing instead to hide in the library or the bathroom. At home, she avoided her parents, retreating to her room and burying herself in schoolwork or music. But even in her lowest moments, Emma couldn't let go of dance. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would stand in front of the mirror in her room and practice. The movements were sloppy at first, her body weighed down by doubt and shame. But as the days went on, something changed. Her reflection no longer looked defeated. Her movements became sharper, more deliberate. Dancing had always been her refuge, and now it became her armor. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Emma found herself scrolling through TikTok. She avoided the Sparkle Squad's account, not wanting to see their perfectly curated lives. Instead, she stumbled upon a video from an independent dancer named Jada, whose bio read, "Dancing is for everyone." Jada's routines were raw and unpolished, but they were bursting with energy and passion. She didn't care about trends or perfection. She danced because she loved it. Emma was captivated. That night, Emma decided she would dance again. Not for Madison, not for the Sparkle Squad, but for herself. She began practicing with renewed determination, trying out new moves and experimenting with styles she'd never attempted before. Her bedroom became her studio, her sanctuary. One morning, as she walked to school, Emma saw a familiar figure tending to her garden. Mrs. Harper was kneeling among her roses, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. Emma had always admired Mrs. Harper's garden. It was the most vibrant on their street, a riot of colors and scents that seemed out of place in their otherwise dull neighborhood. Mrs. Harper looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Emma." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Morning. Everything all right?" Mrs. Harper asked, her tone kind but probing. Emma opened her mouth to say yes, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but something about Mrs. Harper's gaze made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in weeks. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Harper stood, brushing dirt off her hands. "You know, I used to teach dance," she said casually. Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "Saw your audition video," Mrs. Harper continued. "Those girls don't know talent when they see it." Emma's cheeks burned. "You don't have to say that," she muttered. "It was awful." "Nonsense," Mrs. Harper said firmly. "You've got something they don't. Heart. And that's worth more than all the TikTok followers in the world." Emma stared at her, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Harper smiled and patted her shoulder. "If you ever want to dance for someone who actually appreciates it, you know where to find me." For the rest of the day, Mrs. Harper's words echoed in Emma's mind. Could she really start over? Was it possible to reclaim her love for dance, even after everything that had happened? By the time she got home, Emma had made up her mind. She knocked on Mrs. Harper's door and said, "I'm ready." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Mrs. Harper's garage-turned-studio was far from glamorous, but it became Emma's haven. The older woman was a tough but patient teacher, pushing Emma to her limits while always reminding her why she danced in the first place. "Dance isn't about looking perfect," Mrs. Harper said one evening. "It's about telling a story. And you, my dear, have a story worth telling." Emma began to rediscover herself through movement. She worked tirelessly, practicing until her muscles ached and her feet blistered, but she didn't care. For the first time in weeks, she felt alive. Then one day, Mrs. Harper suggested an idea that would change everything. "Why don't we record one of your routines?" she asked. Emma froze. The thought of putting herself out there again was terrifying. But Mrs. Harper's confidence was infectious. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Mrs. Harper said. "This is for you." Emma agreed, though her hands trembled as she set up her phone on a tripod. She chose a quiet spot in the park, away from prying eyes. As the music started, Emma closed her eyes and let herself go. For the first time, she danced without fear or doubt, her movements flowing effortlessly. When she finished, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Mrs. Harper smiled and gave her a thumbs up. "Now, let's show the world." Emma hesitated before uploading the video to TikTok. Her heart raced as she hit the post button, but she told herself it didn't matter what anyone thought. This was her moment, and no one could take it away from her. What she didn't expect was what came next. By the time she woke up the next morning, the video had already been viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in from strangers praising her talent and courage. For the first time in weeks, Emma smiled. This was only the beginning. The gym was packed. Students who had no intention of auditioning for the Sparkle Squad crowded the bleachers, their phones already out, waiting for the drama to unfold. The Sparkle Squad auditions were less about finding talent and more about maintaining their iron grip on the school's social hierarchy. Everyone knew it, including Emma. But she wasn't there for them. She was there for herself. Emma clutched the hem of her sweatshirt as she stood near the edge of the gym, her heart pounding. The chatter around her was deafening, a mix of laughter, whispered gossip, and the constant ping of phone notifications. She had arrived early, hoping to blend into the crowd, but the gym was already buzzing with energy. Madison, Chloe, and Taylor stood at the center of it all, their matching outfits and perfect hair making them look like they belonged on a movie set. Madison's clipboard was tucked under her arm, and she exuded the confidence of someone who had never known failure. "Next up," Madison announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "Emma Collins." The gym seemed to go silent as Emma stepped forward. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, the judgment already starting before she'd even moved. She swallowed hard and forced herself to walk to the center of the gym. Madison looked her up and down, her expression unreadable. "Song choice?" Madison asked, her pen hovering over the clipboard. Emma stammered out the name of her track, her voice barely audible. Madison raised an eyebrow, then smirked. "All right, let's see what you've got." The music started, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Emma moved instinctively, her body sensing with the beat. This was her comfort zone, her escape. She had practiced this routine dozens of times in her room, perfecting every step. But here, under the harsh fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of her peers, the stakes felt impossibly high. She executed a spin and landed in a flawless pose, a small burst of pride blooming in her chest. For a brief moment, she thought she might actually impress them. But as she transitioned into the next move, she caught sight of Madison out of the corner of her eye. The smirk had returned, and she was whispering something to Chloe and Taylor. They giggled, not even trying to hide their amusement. Emma's confidence wavered. She stumbled on the next step, barely catching herself. The laughter from the bleachers grew louder. Someone whispered, "She looks like she's trying too hard." And Emma's face flushed. She kept going, forcing herself to focus on the music, but the magic was gone. Every movement felt awkward, every step heavier than the last. When the music finally ended, the gym erupted, not in applause, but in laughter. Emma froze, her chest tightening as Madison stepped forward, her clipboard held like a shield. "Well," Madison began, her voice dripping with Fox sympathy. "That was something." The room went quiet, everyone waiting for the inevitable punchline. Madison didn't disappoint. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Emma, but we're looking for someone who can really shine, you know. Someone who has that sparkle." She gestured to Chloe and Taylor, who nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of pity and amusement. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, and her eyes burned with unshed tears. The humiliation was unbearable. She turned and walked as quickly as she could toward the gym doors, the laughter following her like a shadow. As she reached the exit, someone called out, "Better luck next time, Collins." The gym erupted in laughter again, and Emma shoved the door open, her vision blurred. She didn't stop walking until she reached the empty hallway outside. She leaned against the cool metal lockers, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, needing to escape into the solace of music or a text from Lisa. But when she unlocked it, her stomach dropped. Notifications were already flooding in. Someone had recorded her audition and posted it online. Her face stared back at her from the screen, frozen mid-step in an awkward pose. The caption read, "When you think you've got moves, but don't #cringe." Emma's hands shook as she scrolled through the comments. "This is painful to watch. Why would she even try? Sparkle Squad forever." Tears blurred her vision, and she shoved her phone into her pocket. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore. The humiliation wasn't confined to the gym. It was now public, a permanent stain on her digital identity. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air and never be seen again. That evening, Emma stayed in her room, ignoring her parents' knocks and Lisa's concerned texts. She couldn't face anyone, not after what had happened. She replayed the audition in her mind, analyzing every mistake, every misstep, until the shame felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She knew Madison had set her up to fail. The entire audition had been a trap, a way to assert the Sparkle Squad's dominance and remind everyone else of their place. Days passed, but the sting of the rejection didn't fade. At school, Emma avoided the cafeteria, eating lunch in the library or sneaking off to the art wing, where fewer people would see her. The video continued to circulate, racking up views and comments. Even teachers seemed to tiptoe around her, their attempts at kindness only making her feel more exposed. But the worst part wasn't the laughter or the comments. It was the silence from the people she thought were her friends. Lisa tried to reach out, but Emma pushed her away, too ashamed to let anyone close. The isolation was suffocating. One afternoon, as Emma walked home from school, she took a detour through the park. It was a quiet, overcast day, the kind that matched her mood. She found an empty bench near the playground and sat down, letting her bag drop to the ground. For a long time she stared at the ground, her thoughts a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and regret. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. Emma looked up to see Mrs. Harper standing nearby, a soft smile on her face. Emma hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Harper sat down beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a while, Neither of them spoke. The sound of children playing in the distance filled the silence. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Harper said finally. Her tone wasn't pitying, just matter-of-fact. Emma stiffened but didn't respond. "You know," Mrs. Harper continued, "when I was your age, I had my fair share of rejections too." Emma glanced at her, skeptical. "You?" Mrs. Harper chuckled. "Oh yes, I wasn't always the graceful dancer you see before you. I was clumsy, awkward, and far too stubborn for my own good. But I loved to dance, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me." Emma stared at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do it anymore. It's too hard." Mrs. Harper reached over and patted Emma's hand. "The hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, my dear. And you have more fight in you than you realize." Emma's throat tightened, but she nodded, her resolve flickering back to life. Mrs. Harper smiled and stood. "Come by my house tomorrow after school. I'll be waiting." As Mrs. Harper walked away, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Emma stood in the middle of Mrs. Harper's garage, staring at her reflection in the old, slightly warped mirrors that lined one wall. The space smelled faintly of sawdust and lavender, remnants of its past life, and Mrs. Harper's love of potpourri. A battered stereo sat on a fold-out table, its paint peeling at the edges, and a single bulb illuminated the room with a soft, golden glow. It wasn't much, but to Emma, it felt like stepping into a sanctuary, a place where she could leave the weight of the world at the door and focus on one thing: dancing. Mrs. Harper stood beside her, her posture impossibly straight for someone in her 70s. Her sharp eyes scanned Emma critically, not with judgment, but with the determination of a seasoned coach who saw potential hidden beneath the layers of self-doubt. "Again," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. Emma nodded, her body aching from hours of practice. She adjusted her stance and reset the music, letting the beat flow through her. It was a new routine, one Mrs. Harper had choreographed specifically for her. It wasn't flashy or trendy like the Sparkle Squad's routines. It was raw, emotional, and entirely hers. She moved through the steps, her body finding its rhythm. Her arms sliced through the air, her feet landing with precision, her movements telling a story of resilience and defiance. But halfway through, she stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of the mat. She let out a frustrated groan, stopping mid-dance. Mrs. Harper clapped her hands sharply. "No, don't stop. Keep going." "But I messed up," Emma protested, brushing her damp hair from her face. "And do you think the audience will care about one misstep if you keep dancing like you mean it? Perfection is overrated, Emma. Passion isn't." Emma hesitated but nodded. She started the routine again, this time throwing herself into it with reckless abandon. By the time the music ended, she was out of breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Harper smiled. "That," she said, "was dancing. Now we're ready." "Ready for what?" Emma asked, wiping the sweat from her brow. "For you to show the world who you really are." The idea had been brewing for weeks. Mrs. Harper had suggested recording one of Emma's routines and posting it online, a direct challenge to the Sparkle Squad's monopoly over TikTok fame. At first, the thought terrified Emma. The last time she put herself out there, it had ended in humiliation. But as the days turned into weeks and her confidence grew, so did her resolve. She wasn't doing this to compete with Madison and her cronies. She was doing it for herself, to reclaim the part of her that they had tried to steal. The next Saturday, they headed to the park. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air was cool but the sun warmed your skin. The trees were ablaze with color, their leaves a mix of fiery reds, golden yellows, and deep oranges. Emma chose a quiet spot near the lake, where the ground was flat, and the backdrop of shimmering water and towering oaks added a natural beauty to her routine. Mrs. Harper set up the tripod and adjusted Emma's phone, her movements precise and efficient. "Remember," she said, her voice steady, "this isn't about them. This is about you." Emma nodded, her nerves jangling. She took her position, her sneakers crunching against the scattered leaves beneath her feet. The music started, and for a moment, she froze. Doubt crept in, whispering in her ear. What if you fail again? What if they laugh? Then she closed her eyes and let the music take over. The world fell away as she moved, her body and soul completely immersed in the rhythm. Every step, every turn, every leap was a declaration of her strength and passion. She danced not just for herself, but for every kid who had ever been made to feel small, who had been told they weren't good enough. When the music ended, Emma stood still, her chest heaving, her cheeks flushed. Mrs. Harper clapped, her face beaming with pride. "Perfect," she said. "Now let's post it." Emma hesitated as she stared at the phone. Her thumb hovered over the post button, the memories of her last viral moment still fresh. But this time, she wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't chasing likes or comments. She was reclaiming her story. With a deep breath, she pressed the button. The video went live. For the rest of the day, Emma tried to keep herself distracted. She cleaned her room, helped her mom with dinner, and even started a new book. But every so often, her thoughts drifted back to the video. What were people saying? Was it being watched? She resisted the urge to check, fearing the worst. It wasn't until the next morning that she finally mustered the courage to look. Her phone buzzed incessantly, the screen lighting up with notifications. She unlocked it, her eyes widening as she took in the numbers. The video had over 100,000 views. Comments flooded in, each one more encouraging than the last. "This gave me chills. You're incredible. Finally, a real dancer on TikTok. Keep doing you, girl. You're inspiring so many people." Emma's heart swelled. She couldn't believe it. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest lifted, replaced by a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. She scrolled through the comments, her smile growing with each one. Strangers from all over the world were cheering her on, validating her in a way she never thought possible. But it wasn't just strangers who noticed. By Monday morning, the video had become the talk of Greystone High. As Emma walked through the hallways, she felt the stares, but they weren't the mocking ones she'd grown used to. These were different, curious, even admiring. A few students approached her, offering words of praise. "Hey, Emma," one girl said, her voice shy. "I saw your video. You're amazing." "Thanks," Emma said, her cheeks flushing. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, but it felt good. Not everyone was thrilled, of course. Madison and the Sparkle Squad were notably absent from the conversation. But Emma could feel their presence, their silent rage simmering beneath the surface. She didn't care. For the first time, their opinions didn't matter. The real turning point came later that week. Emma received a message from a well-known dance influencer, someone with millions of followers on TikTok. The message was simple but life-changing. "Saw your video. Would love to collaborate sometime." Emma stared at her screen, her heart racing. She showed the message to Mrs. Harper, who smiled knowingly. "I told you," she said. "The world is starting to see what I saw all along." They planned another video, this time with a clearer purpose. Emma wanted to use her platform to inspire others, to show them that setbacks didn't have to define them. The next routine she choreographed was dedicated to resilience, with a caption that read, "They tried to break me. I chose to rise." The video gained even more traction than the first, reaching over 1 million views in just a few days. Emma's following skyrocketed, and her inbox was flooded with messages from people sharing their own stories of rejection and triumph. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger, a community of people who understood what it meant to struggle and overcome. By the end of the week, Emma's name was everywhere. Local news outlets reached out for interviews, and her teachers began treating her with a newfound respect. Even Lisa, who had kept her distance during Emma's isolation, approached her with an apology. "I should have been there for you," Lisa said, her voice thick with regret. "You've always been amazing. I just didn't know how to help." Emma hugged her. "It's okay," she said. "I think I needed to do this on my own." As the days turned into weeks, Emma's life began to change in ways she never imagined. She was invited to perform at a local arts festival, where she received a standing ovation. But the most satisfying moment came when Madison and the Sparkle Squad were forced to acknowledge her success. During lunch one day, Madison approached her, her expression carefully neutral. "Hey, Emma," Madison said, her voice unusually soft. "Your videos are impressive." Emma smiled, her confidence unshakable. "Thanks," she said, her tone polite but distant. She didn't need Madison's validation anymore. She had found something far more valuable: self-worth. That night, as Emma sat on her bed, scrolling through the countless messages of support, she realized how far she had come. She wasn't the girl who had stumbled in the gym, humiliated and broken. She was a dancer, a fighter, and a voice for anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. And this was only the beginning. The fallout from Emma's video reverberated through Greystone like a storm, shifting the town's social landscape in ways no one had anticipated. What had started as a quiet personal triumph quickly became a phenomenon, with Emma's story spreading far beyond the confines of her high school. By the time her second video hit 1 million views, Emma wasn't just a name on TikTok. She was a symbol of resilience and authenticity, an underdog who had risen against the odds. At school, the dynamics were changing rapidly. The Sparkle Squad, once untouchable in their reign over Greystone High's social hierarchy, found themselves losing their grip. Their followers on TikTok, which had once seemed unshakable, began to dwindle. Comments on their videos turned from adoration to criticism, with people calling out their treatment of Emma. Madison, Chloe, and Taylor tried to maintain their facade of confidence, but their perfect smiles had cracks now, their glittering confidence dimmed by the weight of public scrutiny. Madison's frustration was palpable. She walked the halls with her chin held high, but her eyes betrayed her. Every glance in Emma's direction, every whispered conversation she overheard, was a reminder of her own diminishing influence. Emma, on the other hand, was blossoming. The same halls that had once felt like a battlefield were now a stage, with students stopping her to offer words of encouragement or ask for selfies. One day during lunch, Emma sat at a table with Lisa, laughing over a shared joke. It had taken time for Emma to let Lisa back in, but the bond between them was stronger now, forged in the fire of their shared experiences. Across the cafeteria, Madison watched them, her jaw tight. She couldn't understand how Emma had gone from the girl they humiliated to the school's most admired figure. It wasn't just jealousy, it was confusion. Emma had broken the rules Madison had always lived by. Power came from control, and control came from crushing anyone who dared to challenge you. Meanwhile, Emma was navigating her new reality with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The messages she received from strangers were overwhelming, but they were also incredibly moving. People shared their stories of rejection, of overcoming obstacles, and of finding strength in unexpected places. Some thanked her for inspiring them to chase their own dreams, while others simply cheered her on, reminding her that she wasn't alone. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a girl named Mia, a fellow high schooler from another state. Maya wrote about how she had been bullied for her love of singing, how she'd almost given up until she saw Emma's video. "You reminded me that my voice matters," the message read. "Thank you for being brave enough to share your story. You've inspired me to keep singing." Emma read the message several times, tears welling in her eyes. She never imagined her journey would resonate with so many people. It was humbling, and it strengthened her resolve to keep dancing, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a reminder that they were enough. Not everyone was supportive, of course. The Sparkle Squad had their defenders, people who claimed Emma was blowing things out of proportion or seeking attention. Anonymous accounts left nasty comments on her videos, accusing her of being dramatic or milking her moment. Emma tried not to let it bother her, but some nights, the negativity got to her. She confided in Mrs. Harper, who offered her usual sage advice. "Success will always attract critics," Mrs. Harper said, handing Emma a cup of tea. "But remember, their words don't define you. Your actions do. Keep dancing, and let the rest fall away." Emma took those words to heart. She poured her energy into her routines, collaborating with other creators and experimenting with new styles. Each new video she posted felt like a small victory, a step further away from the girl who had once doubted herself. And with every step, her audience grew. The turning point came when Emma was invited to perform at a regional dance showcase. It was a prestigious event, one that featured both amateur and professional dancers from across the state. When the invitation arrived, Emma was stunned. She had never considered herself good enough for something so big, but Mrs. Harper wouldn't hear of her hesitating. "This is your moment," Mrs. Harper said, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Take it." Emma threw herself into preparation, practicing every day after school. Mrs. Harper choreographed a new routine for her, one that combined elements of modern and contemporary dance with Emma's unique flair. The routine told a story, her story, of rejection, perseverance, and triumph. Every move was deliberate, every step infused with emotion. The showcase was held at a grand theater in the city, a far cry from the modest spaces Emma was used to. As she stood backstage, surrounded by dancers with far more experience and polish, the familiar pang of doubt crept in. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself of everything she had overcome to get here. When her name was called, Emma stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The audience was a sea of faces, their expressions expectant. The music started, and Emma let it guide her. She moved with a confidence she didn't know she had, her body telling a story that words never could. Every leap, every spin, every gesture was a testament to her journey. By the time the routine ended, the audience was on their feet, applauding with an intensity that took Emma's breath away. Tears streamed down her face as she took a bow, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had done it. She had faced her fears and come out stronger. Backstage, a flurry of congratulatory hugs and handshakes awaited her. A few of the professional dancers approached her, offering words of encouragement and advice. One of them, a renowned choreographer, handed her a business card. "You've got something special," he said. "I'd love to work with you." The night was a whirlwind, but the best moment came when Emma checked her phone and saw a message from her parents. They had been skeptical of her passion for dance, worried it would distract her from more practical pursuits. But the message was clear and heartfelt. "We're so proud of you, Emma. Keep shining." The impact of Emma's performance rippled through Greystone. The local paper ran a story about her, framing her as the town's rising star. The school administration, eager to capitalize on her success, announced plans to revamp their arts program, citing Emma as an inspiration. Students who had once ignored her now treated her with a mix of admiration and awe. But the most surprising reaction came from the Sparkle Squad. Madison, who had spent weeks trying to downplay Emma's success, finally confronted her in the hallway one afternoon. She looked nervous, her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. "Emma," Madison began, her voice hesitant. I wanted to say congratulations. Your performance was amazing." Emma blinked, taken aback. She had expected sarcasm or a backhanded compliment, not genuine praise. "Thank you," she said simply. Madison hesitated, then added, "I guess I misjudged you. I'm sorry for everything." Emma studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity. But Madison seemed earnest, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for rejection. Emma considered her response carefully. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but she knew holding on to resentment wouldn't help anyone. "I appreciate that," Emma said finally. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong." Madison nodded, her expression unreadable, and walked away. It wasn't a resolution, But it was a start. As Emma reflected on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had grown. The girl who had once crumbled under the weight of humiliation was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and more self-assured. She had found her voice and her audience. That evening, as she sat in her room, Emma filmed a new video. She spoke directly to the camera, her tone warm and sincere. To everyone who's ever felt like they weren't good enough, like they didn't belong, this is for you. Keep going. Keep fighting. You're stronger than you know. She posted the video with the caption, "Your story isn't over. Keep writing it." Within hours, it was trending. Emma had become more than a dancer. She was a force to be reckoned with, a beacon of hope for anyone who dared to dream. And she knew her story was just beginning. The night of the showcase marked a turning point in Emma's life, but what followed transformed her not just as a dancer, but as a person. The rush of applause, the heartfelt congratulations, and the flood of messages were validating. But Emma knew her journey wasn't just about fame or recognition. It was about something deeper, something she hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just her story. It was a story about resilience, community, and the power of standing up when the world tried to push you down. In the weeks after her performance, Emma's life became a whirlwind of new opportunities. Invitations poured in from local events and community leaders who wanted to feature her in everything from charity galas to school assemblies. She was asked to speak at the Greystone Youth Summit, an annual event where young leaders inspired their peers. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, but Mrs. Harper encouraged her to embrace it. "They're not asking for perfection," Mrs. Harper said over tea one afternoon. "They want your story, your truth. Speak from the heart, and they'll listen." Emma spent days preparing, practicing in front of a mirror until her nerves began to subside. When the day of the summit arrived, she stood on stage before a sea of faces, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. She took a deep breath and began. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she started, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "A few months ago, I couldn't even walk down the hallway at school without feeling invisible, or worse, like I didn't belong. I let other people's opinions define me. I let fear hold me back. But then I realized something. No one gets to tell you who you are. That's your choice. And when I finally chose to be myself, everything changed." She went on to share her journey, her love of dance, the humiliation of the Sparkle Squad audition, and the transformative power of rediscovering her passion. She spoke about the importance of perseverance and the strength it took to rise after falling. As she finished, the crowd erupted in applause, and Emma felt a wave of pride wash over her. She wasn't just telling her story, she was giving others permission to tell theirs. After the summit, Emma was approached by a group of younger students who had been in the audience. They shyly introduced themselves, each one sharing a piece of their own struggles. Bullying, rejection, fear of failure. One girl, barely 13, clutched Emma's hand and said, "Because of you, I want to try out for the drama club. I was scared before, but now, I think I can do it." Emma's chest tightened. She had set out to prove something to herself, but now she realized the ripple effect of her actions. Every step she took forward was inspiring someone else to do the same. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who needed to see that it was possible to overcome, to thrive, to shine. But with new opportunities came new challenges. Emma's rise to prominence didn't erase the scars of her past. She still encountered whispers and judgment, especially from those who felt threatened by her success. Some accused her of abandoning her humility, of letting the attention go to her head. Others dismissed her entirely, calling her a one-hit wonder or claiming she was just lucky. The comments hurt, but they no longer had the power to paralyze her. Emma had learned how to separate constructive criticism from baseless negativity, and she leaned on her growing support network when the weight became too much. Lisa was her rock, always quick with a joke or a pep talk. Mrs. Harper continued to guide her, reminding her that staying grounded was as important as reaching new heights. One day, Emma returned to the park where she had filmed her first viral video. The leaves had fallen now, covering the ground in a blanket of gold and brown. She stood by the lake, watching the water ripple under the breeze. This place, so unassuming, had become sacred to her. It was where she had found herself, where she had decided that no one else could define her worth. She pulled out her phone and recorded a short video, speaking directly to the camera. "This park is where it all began for me," she said, her voice soft but confident. "It's where I stopped hiding and started living. I know a lot of you out there are struggling, wondering if you'll ever be enough. I want you to know you already are. Don't wait for someone else to tell you that. Claim it, own it, and never let anyone dim your light." She posted the video with a simple caption: "Find your park. Find your strength." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments poured in, with people sharing their own parks, places or moments that had helped them rediscover themselves. Emma realized that her journey wasn't just about dance anymore. It was about creating a movement, a community of people who supported and uplifted each other. The next big milestone came when Emma received an email from a prestigious dance academy. They had seen her videos and were impressed not just by her talent, but by her story. They offered her a partial scholarship to attend their summer program, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to train with some of the best dancers in the world. Emma was elated but also nervous. The academy was in a big city, far from the familiarity of Greystone. She worried about leaving her family, her friends, and Mrs. Harper behind. But Mrs. Harper, as always, had words of wisdom. "Growth requires stepping out of your comfort zone," she said, squeezing Emma's hand. "You've already proven you can handle anything that comes your way. This is your next step." With her family's blessing and Mrs. Harper's encouragement, Emma accepted the scholarship. The summer program was intense, pushing her beyond her limits and challenging her in ways she hadn't expected. She trained alongside dancers who had been honing their craft for years, and at times she felt out of her depth. But instead of retreating, Emma embraced the challenge. She asked questions, sought feedback, and worked harder than ever. By the end of the program, Emma wasn't just a better dancer, she was a better person. She had learned the value of resilience, collaboration, and humility. She returned to Greystone with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to share what she had learned. Back home, she continued to dance, to create, and to inspire. She worked with the school to start a new dance club, one that was open to everyone regardless of skill level. She mentored younger students, helping them find their footing both on and off the stage. And she continued to post videos, each one a testament to her journey and a beacon of hope for her growing community. One day, as she sat in her room reflecting on everything that had happened, Emma received a notification. Her latest video had hit 10 million views, a milestone she had never dreamed of. She smiled, not because of the number, but because of what it represented. Each view, each like, each comment was proof that her story had made an impact. Emma turned to her journal, a habit she had picked up during the summer program, and wrote the simple entry: "Today, I danced for the world. Tomorrow, I'll dance for myself. Always for myself." Her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. Emma knew there would be more challenges, more setbacks, and more opportunities to grow. But she also knew she was ready for them. She had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose, and with every step, she would keep dancing, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed to see that the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting. Emma closed her journal, a smile on her face, and stretched. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again, and with it, another chance to move forward. And she would, one step at a time, one dance at a time, writing her story with every motion. Because that was the beauty of it all. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever dared to dream. And it was far from over.